This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner for Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin today's show with Spencer Casey, K-State Research and Extension Assistant Director for Statewide Operations, and Dan Sullins, K-State Assistant Professor in Wildlife and Outdoor Management. They discuss a K-State research facility on Lonsinger Farms. Casey and Sullins continue today's show by sharing what Lonsinger Farms will contribute. We are also joined by Mary Marsh with Kansas Wheat, where she discusses the Home Baking Association. We conclude today's programming with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he discusses displaced Abomasums in the dairy herd. He says animals with higher body condition scores are not the only animals impacted. Sometimes it's animals with excess abdominal fat. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by two very special guests. We have with us Spencer Casey. He serves as the Assistant Director for Statewide Operations for K-State Research and Extension, as well as Dan Sullins. He is an Assistant Professor in Wildlife and Outdoor Management here at K-State. And they're joining us today for a discussion on the Lonsinger Farms. It is a farm that has a lot of history and a unique connection to K-State, really. And Spencer, we're going to start that discussion with you because you also have a close tie now to this farm. So let's really start with the history of the farm itself. Who did it originally belong to, and what were the goals, really, of this farm?
It was originally owned by Harold Lonsinger. Harold was a graduate of K-State in 1956 and got a degree there in mechanical engineering. And Harold on multiple occasions told me how important that was to him on being a springboard for the rest of his life. And he had a passion about K-State and believed in what we did. So Harold had a distinguished career and retired in 1994 to all places, Cocker City, Kansas. And he explained to me that for about a 2-year period, he spent a lot of time working in his garden. And a gentleman in real estate came by the location and said, "Hey, Harold, we have a piece of ground that we think you might be interested in." Harold went and looked at the property that we're talking about right now, Samantha, and he bought it on site. And then he started adding to it and started farming pretty heavily in 1996. So that's kind of the spin on the whole thing. It's an amazing story. It's a connection with K-State. It's a neat guy that had a very distinguished career and then decided to start a second one.
Wow. And, you mentioned this piece of property. It's an expansive set of land that we're talking about here.
Yeah, it is. The bulk of the farm is located north of Alton, 4 or 5 miles. That's the main headquarter area. It's thousands of acres. He's also got a little bit of land just immediately to the east of Alton as well. Harold built that up over time and, started working and communicating with the dean's office. I mean, he had a belief that when he took over that land that he wanted to get it back in shape and bring it back to the point like it was 100 years ago, believed in sustainability. And, when you start a new endeavor, kind of like his first career, you start seeking education, and that's where the collaboration came with the university.
Sure. So that collaboration with the university, he really valued that, like you've said so far. And that's kind of why he wanted to start executing a plan to really leave this farm in the hands of K-State Research and Extension, right?
Right. He met with a couple of our faculty from the College of Agriculture, really enjoyed talking to them about the land and what possibilities were. And, just basically one thing led to another, and he had a passion for it. He always felt like the Kansas State University gave him something, and he felt like that he could give it back and giving it back in the sense that we could do something special with that gift that he gave us.
Wow, what a beautiful story. And unfortunately, you mentioned Harold was 90. He passed away, unfortunately, at that age. And of course, when someone's older like that, you expect for it to happen at some point. But his death was really a sudden thing. And unfortunately, that kind of sped up the process of acquiring this land for K-State, right?
He enjoyed checking on his cattle. He enjoyed going out and working on equipment. He was really good at going out in the evenings. That was kind of his time frame. So, Harold's death was unexpected. it rushed us into something that, we've been planning on, of course, but, you're never ready to make that transition. And we've done the best that we can over the last couple of years. And I think looking back on it, the last 2 years or so, I think Harold would say that we've done a pretty darn good job.
Well, that's wonderful. What a mark of, what you've done with it, really. And we'll get into that here in a moment. But you were dealing with the grief of a friend that you had really gotten to know over the years. And like you said, you were kind of rushed into this process that you had spoken about, and you really knew Harold's vision. And that's really why I think you've been able to execute the plan to his standards, would you say, really, that he kind of left to you before he passed?
I went out there, worked on equipment with Harold. I went out and rode around the ATV with Harold. Harold, the whole time that we got together, would share his vision and the way that he would like to see the property managed and handled. And, at the time, I didn't realize that how precious those moments were, but they were imperative, because I was able to hear directly from him kind of what he hoped to accomplish at the property. So after his passing, we started working with the cattle herd that he had and making arrangements for that. We started working on the buildings and the infrastructure that are there. And, it's a transitional period, I guess, from moving it from a farming operation into a research extension center. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of foresight. A good example of that would be is that Harold, since he had most of the day, would go out and take water with his ATV to all of his cattle across the property. That was his thing. He'd give them a chance to interact with them, see how they're doing. Well, as a research and extension facility, you need to have those waters in place for replicated research. So, there's just a lot to do, and boom, here we were.
Sure. So these past several years, that's really what it's been, is just updating the infrastructure of this land to make it, like you said, up to scale for an R1 research institution like we are here at K-State.
Ironically enough, when I first started working for K-State 25 years ago, we were given a property southwest of Hayes called the HB Ranch. And one of my first tasks at that property was to do kind of what we're talking about now, to develop the infrastructure, put fence around the property, put buildings in that are necessary to conduct replicated work with cattle, waters, things like that. So I got a little bit of a training course 20 years ago on how to do some of this. So yes, right now what we're doing is working on infrastructure projects. We've built a new roadway into the property that's on high level ground. We've gathered up all of Harold's equipment. A lot of that's been liquidated. We're starting to acquire equipment that can be used for future research. We're adding electricity to each building. Harold had, the single one light bulb approach. We're putting in a few more lights than that. We're cleaning up, some of the property as well. It's a process to get it to where then when we have grad students and professors come to the facility, that they have a place to eat a meal, get out on the property, check things out, and do what was envisioned by Harold, and that's do research. So in a sense, I consider myself as being the person that's paving the way for that to happen, for the smart people to come along and do their jobs.
Well, what an important role that is. Not, you say, for the smart people. It takes a smart person to set up the infrastructure to do that. So lots of applause for you here, Spencer, in getting this job done. And you've made a way already, even though it's just been several years, for someone like Dan to start doing research at this property already. So Dan, tell us a bit about the work that you've been doing. I know it's been somewhat ecology based and kind of observing and documenting some of the biodiversity that's currently going on at Lonsinger Farm, right?
That's right. Thanks, Samantha. And thanks, Spencer, for all your hard work, making Lonsinger property accessible for everyone. We really appreciate that. So I'd like to first state that we've only been out there 1 year, so we've just been starting. So we're kind of getting just that baseline data on the plants and the animals that are on the property. So we've been doing some herbaceous vegetation surveys, basically going out, identifying grass species, walk transects throughout the property, and every time your right big toe hits the ground, identify those plants. We've also going out and evaluating all the trees on the property, counting the birds at random locations throughout the property. Then we've also put out several just your generic trail cameras on the property to look at and kind of get an idea for the larger mammal community on the property. So we did all that last summer, and we'll be out there again this summer. We found a variety of plant species on the property. Some of them are really desirable native plants from an ecologist perspective. There's some little blue stems, switchgrass, big blue stem, Cytops grama. There's a lot of different native wildflowers out on the property. A lot of your sunflowers, ragweed, of course, some of your scurf peas. And also there's a really unique plant on the property known as Fremont's clematis, which is it really only occurs in two parts of the country, in that area in Kansas and up in Nebraska, and then also in the eastern Ozarks on kind of some of these limestone areas. So there's not much known about it. And I'm more of a wildlife specialist, so I won't talk too much about that, but there's a lot of interesting plants on the property. There's also a lot of woody species that have kind of encroached in this area, which historically would have been more grassland. So there's a lot of honey locusts on some portions of the property, and we're really curious how wildlife in those areas that have more woody species might differ from other portions of the property that are more grassland. So we're evaluating that right now. We haven't really dug too deep the data analyses yet, but we're starting work on that now.
We're cutting to a short break now, but Samantha's conversation with Spencer and Dan about Lonsinger Farms will continue when we are back on Agriculture Today. You are tuned back in with Agriculture Today, and we are joined now again with K-State Research and Extension Assistant Director for Statewide Operations, Spencer Casey, and Assistant Professor in Wildlife and Outdoor Management, Dan Sullins, as they continued the conversation about Lonsinger Farms Sustainability Research Facility with Samantha Bennett.
Well, it sounds like there's obviously a plethora of work that could be done just from this baseline that you're starting now. And, we're talking about thousands of acres, like Spencer said. So the diversity that you're seeing, is it a bit overwhelming right now at this point in the process?
Well, yeah, there's quite a few species. We've identified, 52 different bird species. A lot of your grassland songbirds found out there, upland sandpipers, and also some of your game species that people are really interested in. We found a northern bobwhite, ringneck pheasant, and there was one lone greater prairie chicken on a portion of the property. So yeah, it's very exciting to be out there, and there's a lot of potential with the property.
Yeah, as you're working through it, are you finding yourself dreaming about kind of the potential studies that could come from this piece of land in the future?
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really unique about this property from a research standpoint, oftentimes, kind of the research paradigm is that you bring on a master's student for 2 or 3 years, you go do a study, it's over. But the potential with this property is that there'd be more long-term research opportunities going after that same property and evaluating it over a much longer period. I think also the really interesting component of this property for me, I'm really interested in the wildlife ecology side of things, but I'm also interested in finding how to manage wildlife and also manage properties that can be productive. And I think that's kind of the key to helping a lot of these wildlife species.
Absolutely, especially in a state like ours where so much of our land really is dedicated to agriculture. But the realization that we have such a unique opportunity in this part of the world to be doing, amazing work with encouraging biodiversity at the same time, like you pinpointed. So what an opportunity to use this farm to do exactly that. Spencer, I'm really excited as we're talking with Dan here, and I hear about, the other research that's currently going on at the farm, to think about the future of the farm. So when you think about the future of the farm, what do you envision for it?
I'm just listening to Dan talk, and I thought about what Harold would have thought about that. Harold had a passion for wildlife as well. He would be super stoked to have Dan out there doing this type of stuff. Matter of fact, I don't think Dan would have been able to get a whole lot done because Harold would have been in his ear talking to him about it the whole time that he was on the property.
I love that.
Yeah. So the future, this is the exciting part about developing one of these centers. I mean, that's really exciting is seeing something like this happening. And, there's others that are just starting to get ramped up as well. So we hope to develop a building up there for field days, to where we could showcase some of the things that we're doing on the property periodically, and then Dan mentioned the uniqueness of the property. Well, it's a large piece of land. So these guys that are involved in crops, I mean, Chuck Rice just mentioned this recently. Hey, we can go up there and do research on large scale bases. It's 25 acre allotments instead of, small 1 acre plots. So, I mean, there's so many things, and we've got a large group of folks that are talking about this property on a regular basis. It's an advisory committee to the dean. And, I think the dean and the foundation and Marty Draper, and I'd like to also mention Vera Prasad. I mean, they met with, Harold. They understood Harold's vision. They want to see good things happen out there, and it just takes time. I mentioned at the beginning that I've had practice. I've done this at one other facility. Well, it took at least 10 years to get that in condition to be able to do work with cattle, replicated work with cattle, to be able to put cover crops out there and do research that Augustino Bohr is doing out there right now. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes money to do that. And we're working on all phases of those. So I just see it being a deal where we, over time, start adding more and more of this in, and it becomes a hub for K-State, a knowledge hub for K-State in north central Kansas. And to be honest, we really don't have that presence up there in this sense. So this really fills a need. Hopefully we can reach out to a lot of the communities in that area and farmers and become a big partner with theirs.
The opportunity for field days. Wow, talk about a game changer for that area. Like you said, just not a lot of opportunity for that sort of setup right now in those communities. And how important and how incredible is it to be a part of laying the foundation for this sort of facility for K-State? I mean, that must excite both of you, right? Thinking about being the beginning of such a long-term research facility here at our university?
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I reflect a little bit every now and then when I'm out there on what Harold would think if he could see what we have done. And I still think it's a positive thing. He would have a lot to say about it. And again, he would want to see those people like Dan out on the property doing work. We've got grad students showing up there now. We're planning on having our advisory committee go out there in May, right, Dan? It's May we're going out there. So, yeah, lots of things happening. It's exciting because it's new. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I being there at the foundation, I think it is really exciting, and there's a lot of thinking to be done, and there's been a lot of good discussions. There's so many different directions you can go with that property. There's been discussions of looking at things like regenerative agriculture, maybe trying out some different grazing systems, maybe patch burn grazing. So there's a lot of different things to think about. And it's exciting to be a part of those conversations with folks in agronomy and also with some of the beef cattle specialists. Just having that opportunity has been really beneficial for me. Of course, at times it'd be great to just be like, well, all this data is already collected so I can analyze it. But it's really, really beneficial for me to be a part of this foundational process.
Absolutely. And what a unique opportunity. We boast about collaboration here at K-State a lot, and that's evident in a lot of the projects we do. But it sounds like at this farm specifically, there's going to be so much collaborative learning that's taking place. And I think that's even more exciting for researchers like yourself, Dan, like you just mentioned.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, I can't thank both of you enough for joining us today. I think that this is obviously something that we're going to be talking about for a very long time in the future on Ag Today programming. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about all of the research that comes out of this and how it continues to grow and evolve over time. But thank you so much, Spencer and Dan, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Samantha. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Spencer Casey. He is the Assistant Director for Statewide Operations for K-State Research and Extension, as well as Dan Sullins. He is an Assistant Professor in Wildlife and Outdoor Management here at K-State. Talking about the history of the Lonsinger Farm, but also the current research going on there and the future that we see for this facility as well.
We continue now with Mary Marsh from Kansas Wheat Commission with this week's Wheat Scoop.
For Eric Wall, Director of Sales at Graincraft, milling in McPherson is a family tradition, as is active involvement in the Home Baking Association, a nonprofit organization that promotes increased home baking. Any company that has a presence in the baking aisle should be a part of the HBA because the vision is to grow the practice of home baking. Whether you sell flour, sugar, yeast, any kind of ingredient, even baking utensils, pans, or baking mats, Wall said, who is currently serving his second term as HBA president. It makes sense for a company like Graincraft to be a member because we want the association to continue to teach and educate and keep people baking at home. So that's why we've stayed involved for all these years. Wall's family were not charter members of the HBA. Their membership dates back to the 1960s, originally through their family-owned milling company in McPherson. Wall joined the family business after he graduated from Kansas State University in 1982 with a degree in agricultural economics. The company was sold to Cereal Food Processors in 2000, a company that was acquired by the Milner Pendleton in 2014. The acquisition resulted in the creation of a new company, Graincraft. Graincraft's networks of mills supplies bagged and bulk flour to customers from coast to coast. Where Wall continues to work is Graincraft's primary small packaging mill, supplying 2 to 50-pound sacks, primarily for retail. This strong connection to the retail sales makes the HBA an ideal organization for Graincraft, since the HBA provides resources to anyone who teaches or fosters home baking skills and promotes the benefits of baking. The HBA recently sponsored a 3-day event with the Family Career and Community Leaders of America, FCCLA, a national career and technical student organization for young people in the family and consumer sciences in public and private schools. The 2023 Baking and Milling Industry Immersion brought students and teachers to Manhattan, Kansas, to tour local bakeries, flour mills, and the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center. The KWIC is also home to Graincraft Innovation Lab, a space focused on quality and product performance analysis. Wall credited Charlene Patton, HBA Executive Director, and Sharon Davis, longtime HBA family and consumer sciences educator, as integral reasons why the HBA continues to succeed in their mission of promoting home baking through activities like the recent FCCLA event. He also wants wheat farmers to know the connection between families who purchase baking ingredients, retailers, and milling companies like Graincraft flows directly back to the Kansas farm. Learn more about the HBA at www.homebaking.org. With Kansas Wheat, this is Mary Marsh.
Once again, that was Mary Marsh with Kansas Wheat Commission sharing this week's Wheat Scoop. Agriculture Today will continue after a short break.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Displaced abomasums in dairy cattle are not common, but they do occur and can be costly. Animals with higher body condition scores are more likely to have issues with fat mobilization and displaced abomasum. However, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that excess abdominal fat, possibly associated with trying to achieve higher levels of milk production, may be impacting the genes associated with fat metabolism.
You know, for most of us in the dairy industry, we see some displaced abomasums in the herd. Usually it's not a huge deal. It is for the individual animal that develops with this disorder, but as we look at it as a herd health issue across the herd, generally we're not seeing extreme rates for displaced abomasums. However, for every animal that comes down with this issue, it's fairly costly. When you look at some of the recent reports as to what that actually cost us in our dairy herd, those numbers would be anywhere from about $450 to maybe nearly $650 per case. And in some cases, it could be higher than that because, unfortunately, sometimes it's not something we can have an animal recover from. So it does increase the fact that we'll see some increased culling as a result of animals that have had displaced abomasums, or as we commonly call them, DAs. So Some interesting things that are happening along this front. Generally, these are going to occur in about the first month of lactation is when we normally see those. And we've known for some time that those animals that have a higher body condition score, they're carrying more excess flesh at calving, are more likely to have some issues with fat mobilization. And as a result of that, we generally see a little bit of excess body fat mobilized during this time. Animals turn ketotic and they go off feed. Oftentimes when they go off feed, that's when we'll see a displaced abomasum in the animal. So these things are kind of tied together. However, there's some new information out that is actually quite interesting. Sometimes in our herds, we do experience an animal with a displaced abomasum that is not carrying excess body fat. So when we look at their body condition score data, we'd look at that and say, well, that's kind of unusual because she really wasn't carrying excess condition, but yet we ended up with a DA. So what might be going on? Well, if you're having your veterinarian do surgery to relieve the DA situation and get the abomasum tacked back down to the bottom of the body cavity, you might also visit with your veterinarian about what they're finding in terms of internal body fat. A lot of times it's reported that these animals that seem to have fairly normal body condition that do develop a DA, they actually have excess abdominal fat. So why is this? Why would animals that be carrying more abdominal fat than what we would expect based on their body condition score? Well, this could be genetic, and this is something that may help us in future years as we start to look to ways to maybe reduce the number of DAs in our herd. There may be some genetic markers that we can look at in the future that may help us identify those animals that have a tendency to develop more abdominal fat. Interestingly, some of these issues may be associated with looking for higher levels of milk production because that may impact the genes that are associated with fat metabolism and thus the depositing of abdominal fat versus fat that might be located closer to the cow's body surface along her back and spine. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to continue to look for ways that we can reduce the number of DAs that happen in our dairy herds.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder to listen to Agriculture Today anytime. Go to agtoday.net where you can listen on demand and find links to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Stitcher Radio. You can also subscribe on your mobile device using any podcast app, including Apple, Spotify, Chrome, and Stitcher. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.